Welcome to the Baker Institute. We're very pleased to be graced with the presence of David Eyton. He's the head of technology at BP. He's going to talk today about the technology outlook that BP prepares. It's a moving target. I think we were discussing that upstairs a little bit. So hopefully that will come out in the Q&A in the course of his remarks. But I think one of the things that certainly will stand out in any discussion about technology is the importance of technological innovation, not only in finding and providing energy services, but also in managing how efficiently we use energy resources. Certainly the issues of today are not the same as the issues of 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago. There are certainly new concerns, particularly from the environmental perspective, that continue to mount. And it becomes ever more important to figure out ways to meet those challenges in an economically and commercially feasible way. And that's exactly where technology sits in the domain of energy and economic well-being. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to David. And at the end, just so you know of his remarks, we will have a Q&A. There are microphones in the aisle, so at the conclusion of his remarks, I'll stand up and invite you to the mics. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Ken, for inviting me here today to talk at this wonderful institute. It's also great to be back in Houston, where I lived and worked for around about 5 years. I think it's very fitting that there's an energy institute here in, I think, what many people view as a location that has a special place in the world of energy. I'm, as Ken has said, BP's head of technology, and that means, in our terms, that I'm responsible for the company's technology strategy, for conducting research and development, and also for exploring and potentially kicking off new businesses in areas of corporate renewal. So it's great to be here, and thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along. We have, for a long time in BP, analyzed long-term technology trends. I suspect many of our other companies in the sector do so, and we do this to try and identify opportunities and disruptions in the world of energy. In the next just over 20 minutes or so, what I will try and do is highlight some of the core findings of that work. There's a book which is available online, which is actually a summary of all the work. And then we'll have about half an hour for Q&A. For those who want to look at the book, it comprises 5 chapters. The first chapter really is the provenance of energy resources. The second one is about the different value chains with a focus on transportation and power. Then you go on to the sustainability of energy, what are the intersection of energy and natural resources, and it ends up with a section on potential and emerging and disrupting technologies, which will make my forecasts and anybody else's forecasts for that matter wrong. But nevertheless, they're reasonable at the time that they're written. And you might ask, why did we publish this document? And I think one of the main reasons is that there was a growing interest from investors and other stakeholders in our business as to the basis upon which we make decisions. And that in particular included early last year a resolution to our company's AGM to explain how it is that we manage climate risks. And it turns out that quite a bit of the work that we were doing as part of our energy technology outlook is responsive to that question. And so we published it a little bit later last year in the run-up to COP21 in Paris. So this is an industry-wide view at 2050 of what might be technically possible. It's certainly not a forecast, and it's based on analysis conducted in 2012 of data which was hence available in 2011. So time has moved on a bit, and I'll try and highlight a little bit what's changed since then relative to what we thought might happen. The reference point is $80 a barrel in 2050. So that's a little bit of an introduction to it. A little bit of history first. Many of you will absolutely know this, I know. But industrialization in the world since the middle part of the 18th century has been largely enabled by fossil fuels, that is, oil and gas and coal, providing heat, power, and mobility to industry and consumers. The past 3 decades, however, have seen a huge surge in a number of trends, basically a doubling in the consumption of energy over the last 30 years, driven in particular by demand from the emerging economies in places like China and India. But even today, we have 1 billion people in the world who do not have access to electricity. So it's not uniform in the way it's impacted the development of the world. And obviously, despite that growth in demand, and demand continues to grow, the oil and gas industry, as many, I suspect, in this room will know, is going through tough times. The price of oil has come down by roughly 2/3, and it's probably the 4th or 5th, depending upon how you calculate them, crash in my career. And no doubt, as before, we will adjust and get through it. But this time, the crash was caused by oversupply. And that has its origins in technology, and that is the so-called shale phenomenon, which kicked off here in the United States. No doubt supply and demand will come back into balance, but that could take some time, and then the cycle will turn. But the big challenge, as Ken, I think, laid out in his earlier remark there, is to meet growing demand in the world with less environmental impact. That was demonstrated in the landmark agreement in Paris, and that is an agreement which BP strongly supports for what it's worth. So if I go firstly to the provenance of energy, this chart is a bit complicated in one respect. It compares theoretically accessible energy resources in 2050 with finite resources of things like coal, oil, gas, and uranium. And in order to do that, we've divided the reserves of the finite resources by 50. So assume they're produced over a 50-year basis, and compare that with things that come in on an ongoing basis. But there are some constraints around this. So, for example, solar can't be done, it's assumed to be anywhere, not in the sea. Certainly, it's assumed to be where you could practically do it out to 2050. So there's some constraints on it. But the numbers are obviously very big. In fact, 20 times expected human demand in 2050 could, in theory, be supplied. And actually, nearly all of any one of these forms of energy, if the whole world said we're going to go X, you could possibly supply all of our needs out of X, any one of the things on that page. Technology can certainly unlock plentiful supplies of almost any of these sources of energy. However, both fossil and non-fossil fuels are not distributed equally around the world, and one region's best choices will definitely differ from another region's best choices. The absolute volumes on here really aren't actually the point. The relative proportions are quite interesting, and they vary also geographically. But the actual usage of energy will be defined by many different factors: their cost of supply, energy density, remoteness from demand, supply chain constraints, intermittency, and other factors like that. And obviously, when taken together, it means that only a limited proportion of those resources will actually be used. But from our perspective, the question is actually more one of what kind of energy do we want than it is will we have enough energy. That's the bigger question. So if we go now to the world of oil and gas, which is a world that I think BP knows a bit more about amongst this mix. There are, on current trends, something like 2.5 trillion barrels of oil and gas equivalent that will be consumed to 2050. We actually estimate that on the basis of the application of today's best technologies, something approaching double this can actually be produced from discovered oil and gas resources in the world, some 4.8 trillion barrels equivalent. And future advances in technology and new discoveries could add a further 2.7 trillion barrels of oil equivalent, making 7.5, i.e. 3 times the desired amount out to 2050. The most significant change in this picture over the last 10 years has been the advent of production from shale and tight rocks. That's reservoirs with low permeabilities, very low permeabilities. This has more than doubled the total potentially exploitable oil and gas resources underground over the last 10 years. So something like 25 trillion barrels in place to 45 trillion barrels in place could potentially be economically exploited, that has already been discovered globally. And this boom, as I said, has its foundations in directional drilling and hydraulic fracturing, which coincidentally Amoco back in 1947 patented. Now part of the BP group. So that's oil and gas. If we go to the power value chains, this chart shows the costs of generating electricity in North America from different fuel feedstocks, assuming a gas is priced at $5 million per BTU. And it shows the actual costs in dollars per megawatt hour in 2012, and it shows a prognosed or projected cost in 2050. And this ignores all taxes, all duties, any feed-in tariffs, subsidies, whatever you like. It's just underlying costs. But it does include the cost of providing backup for intermittent sources of power, and that cost ranges from about $8 a megawatt hour if you can simply use a system that's already there, to more like $30 a megawatt hour if you've got to build backup, which in this case is assumed to be open cycle gas-fired power, because certainly when we did that analysis, it was the cheapest source of backup we could come up with, cheaper, for example, than, say, batteries or something like that. In the power sector, gas and coal-fired power are generally most competitive today, but we expect wind and solar to continue reducing costs at around 14% per doubling for wind, 24% per doubling in volume for natural gas, consistent with their past performance. A carbon price, which is shown at $40 a tonne and $80 a tonne on these charts, would clearly increase the costs for power from fossil fuels. A modest price on carbon certainly makes natural gas much more competitive than coal, and gas is as cleaner than coal as well. At higher carbon prices, wind and solar become more competitive, providing there is backup generation available when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining. And gas-fired power with carbon capture and sequestration, in our view, can be competitive at $80 a tonne by 2050. So that's the power value chain. The transport value chain is actually really quite different in character from the power value chain. If you look at it, the amounts of dark green, light green, orange on here vary very significantly from the previous graph. We see the potential for significantly reducing emissions at a comparatively low cost of carbon as being much greater in the power sector than they are in the transport sector. This chart shows the total cost for a passenger to travel in cents per kilometre, again in North America, using different types of engine, and an oil price of $80 a barrel. Again, ignoring all taxes and duties and that kind of thing. And the thing I would draw your eye to is the dominance of the upfront cost of the vehicle in the lifetime cost of transportation. This is a really important decision that consumers make, and once they've purchased a vehicle, that effectively defines the cost of traveling for the life of that vehicle. On this basis, we expect liquid fuels to continue dominating the global transportation system through to 2035 and beyond, and this is largely because liquid fuels have a high energy density. In terms of technology, we expect the average efficiency of new light-duty vehicles to improve by about 2 to 3% per annum as a result of increased hybridization and improved powertrains combined with advanced fuels and lubricants. Advances in battery technology may see electric vehicles approaching cost parity with the internal combustion engine, while fuel cell vehicles appear to have somewhat further to go. However, air quality is a major driver of decisions in conurbations, in urban environments, due to the health impacts of high loading of particulates in the atmosphere, and hence things like fuel cell vehicles and electric battery vehicles have an advantage in that particular environment. So if you come now to the intersection of the energy industry and natural resources, this slide shows a global analysis of other natural resource constraints applicable to the energy business, from land, from water, from minerals, and of course from our atmosphere. And this is based upon BP-funded research at 15 universities worldwide over about a 3 or 4 year period. And the arrows on this slide are scaled as a proportion of total usage. So what this basically shows is that climate change is the most significant potential constraint facing our industry, the orange arrow being roughly 2/3 of the total contribution to climate change. Fresh water challenges are a much more immediate, complex, and local issue. They're not averaged globally via the atmosphere, for example. However, contrary to perhaps popular belief, fossil fuel extraction accounts for less than 1% of global freshwater extraction, with 12% used but not consumed to cool power plants. Modern biofuels are a small part of the agricultural system. They're currently less than 2% of cropland, but we are well aware that they sit at the nexus of stresses on land, the so-called food versus fuel debate. And there appears to be adequate physical supply of the minerals needed for the world's energy systems. However, some rare earth minerals and chromium needed for steel, as it relates to our industry, are produced in very few locations around the world and certainly vulnerable to supply chain disruption. So lastly, in terms of where this is all going to be wrong, and we can't predict why, the nature of certain fields of technology gives them great disruptive potential. This shows horizons looking out 2030, 2040, 2050, and the potency of certain trends to impact the world's energy systems in that time frame. If you combine the underpinning capabilities of modular devices with those areas of science and technology that have an exponential nature, you can have a very potent and winning combination. Developments in advanced materials could lead to extraordinary performance improvement for batteries, solar cells, and the use of hydrogen as a fuel. However, even in a success scenario, these technologies would take decades to deploy at scale, due to the huge amounts of capital that are required, and hence widespread disruption from them before about 2030 is quite unlikely. In the shorter term, digital technologies, and by that I mean sensors, data analytics, control systems underpinned by supercomputing, have the greatest potential to drive far-reaching change, offering multiple opportunities to make the energy sector safer, more efficient, more reliable, and more cost-effective. And actually, it's quite difficult to imagine the full potential of what I call digital technologies there, when I know at least one fairly well-renowned commentator in our industry who expects humans to be overtaken intelligence by machines in around about 2030. So then, by conclusion, what I'd like to say is that the analysis shows, and I don't actually think there's a lot of rocket science in there, that energy resources are technically plentiful. And certainly the concern that oil and gas are going to run out anytime soon, I think, has largely gone away. Technology has great potential to increase the supply of both fossil fuels and non-fossil fuels while reducing their cost. The major concern relating to energy is clearly the impact on greenhouse gas emissions of the consumption of fossil fuels, and the Paris Climate Agreement recognized the needs to balance the right of countries to develop with the need to protect the planet. Technology, in our view, is critical because it offers ways to overcome this dilemma, including advances that enable energy to be used more efficiently and make low-carbon energy less expensive and more competitive. As I think the work that we did in the publication we put out shows, putting a meaningful and effective price on carbon, however you do that, globally could accelerate the development of low-carbon technology and drive a decisive shift towards a lower carbon energy system. Thank you for listening to an overview of our work, and I am now very happy to take questions from the floor.
Just ask if you have a question to come to the aisle so you can speak to the microphone.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. Since World War II, upstream petroleum research grew, bloomed during the 60s and 70s, plateaued in the 80s, pretty much declined in the 90s, and is now left to a few of the large national companies and the largest commercial petroleum companies. How long before it's pretty much only in contracting commercial service companies and universities, and the upstream producers are out of the research business completely? Thank you.
So, I mean, obviously, at least from a commercial perspective, one invests in technology because one thinks there's a business case for it. And there are various drivers on it, but obviously the demand for whatever it is you produce in the energy system is what fundamentally creates the business case for doing it and the implicit price on that. I would say that you're right. In around about the late 80s, certainly, the very, very big, well, and before that probably 70s and 80s, the very, very big research labs that companies had in them were shut down, and a lot of that research migrated into universities and national labs. There's a good reason for that, actually, because we can't use some of synchrotrons and such like inside BP full time. There's no way we could use one of those things. So, I mean, a lot of these very, very big measurement devices and other capabilities that now sit in national labs and universities, you could never, ever imagine doing that, having that and owning that inside a company. That the endeavor of research globally, and I mean globally, increasingly in places like China and India and others, has grown enormously. So I think the days are over when you think you could do all that in-house. So my assertion would be that companies, whether they're in the service sector or they're operators, and whether they're in oil and gas or frankly the other parts of the energy system, try and be selective in where they spend their research and development dollars in order to try and be competitive within their sector. And they tend to have a view as to where they think they can be most competitive. That's what they focus on. The numbers are still quite large. I mean, the big companies are spending approaching $1 billion a year in research and development. That's quite significant. If you consider mission innovation, the objective there of the 20 countries who signed up is to grow government-sponsored energy R&D from $10 billion a year to $20 billion a year. So the fact that some companies are spending $1 billion a year by themselves, it's still quite a material contribution, I think. As to how long that'll carry on for, I mean, it will do in some part of the energy system. The question is how is that energy system going to evolve, and hence where is it worthwhile spending the money? And that's actually quite difficult to call. So we do a certain amount of our research in BP into alternatives, renewables, low carbon, but the majority still is associated with improving our core oil and gas businesses. I mean, the only other comment I make is that, we do think that we've reached the time in the history of the world when there's greater potential to get more oil and gas out of fields that have already been discovered than there is to add to the plate by discovering new fields. So that point, I think, is reached, and that's a lot to do with the application of technology in discovered fields.
In your points on transportation as well as disruptive technologies, I think a couple of things that appear to be neglected were the impact of shared economy like Uber, Airbnb, as well as, I just drew a blank on my second point. Address the Airbnb, and if it comes to my mind, I'll come back.
Well, I think maybe where you might have been going is that, is the business case for choices in the transportation system going to be affected by new ways of owning vehicles and those sorts of autonomy, electric vehicles, all that kind of stuff. And I thought it might have been. I had the autonomy word on my lips, so I didn't want to jump in.
The fuel economy.
Yeah. It's actually unclear to us right now whether autonomy and or car sharing, to take two examples, is actually going to reduce or increase the demand for energy. It's unclear. Everyone assumes that car sharing is going to significantly reduce the demand for energy. It certainly shifts the balancing case between an electric vehicle and a fossil vehicle, because the more you can use a battery and use more electricity, the greater the business case for using it. So it could accelerate the payback times on an electric vehicle, but it'll also accelerate the rate at which that battery deteriorates in performance as well. So it can shift the business case for choices that people have. But just to take, for example, autonomy, I'll take the case of fridges and refrigerators in the United States. Refrigerators have got more and more efficient, and what's happened is people now have 3 rather than 1, and actually the overall consumption hasn't changed at all. And the real question is, if you can send your car to go and do the shopping, and pick up a friend and a few other things. Is that a new kind of modality or functionality that you think is really cool and you're going to use your vehicle more because you can just send it off to do things when you don't want to be there? Or is it going to mean that, you know, you somehow organize your life much more efficiently and there's less traveling going on? I don't think so. So yes, it changes the business case for purchasing and who's likely to own vehicles. It doesn't necessarily reduce the demand for energy, which is obviously another important driver in the world's energy systems.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. My question is regarding technologist jobs. Your answer to the first question, basically that was a shift of technologist jobs from oil and gas industry out. So as research centers closed, then technologists were shifted out of oil and gas companies, and some ended up in academia, and some left to other industries. Now, my question is, what is your view about the impact of data analysis and artificial intelligence as it impacts white-collar technologists' work inside technologies in oil and gas?
So I think I would start off by saying that we are not hugely impressed by the pace at which the oil and gas industry has taken up some of these technologies. We probably would have to go into a lexicon here because one person's artificial intelligence is not another person's artificial intelligence. But the reality is that at least I think our industry tended to use advanced data analytics predominantly for seismic imaging. That was the biggest source of data in our industry, and we did an awful lot of work on data science, computing, algorithm development in that area. And it's only comparatively recently, and the digital oil field concept kicked off in about 2000, plus or minus. But it's been quite slow, and if you compare the reliabilities that we have in our industry with, say, the reliabilities that you have, I know, come to expect by when getting on an aircraft and flying from A to B, you would not have got on the aircraft if it had the overall efficiencies of some of the operations in our industry. So there's a huge opportunity to improve the efficiency and reliability of what it is we do from the application of and a whole suite of technologies, of which artificial intelligence and cognitive computing sit at the top of that pyramid, and you can go a heck of a long way down the road by just decent data analytics. So I think this is just beginning to impact our industry significantly. You don't have automated rigs, you have closed-loop drilling on components of the drilling operation, but not the whole thing. We're just beginning to bring in advanced control systems on very complex subsea production systems, for example. But that's comparatively new. It was quite difficult for a while to get sensors that were cheap enough and reliable enough and actually rated for many of the zones of operation of our industry until really quite recently. So that probably stood in the way. But now I see BP's research and development expenditure did come down 2014 to 2015, but mainly because we shut down a couple of businesses. But actually, the investment in this area, which is largely about having sensors that work and data analytics that work, and beginning to get into small closed-loop automated systems, that's growing significantly in our company. I think we're quite a long way away from endemic machine learning and all the other things that go into cognitive computing, use of natural language processing, or a defect or alerts for things that are going wrong, hypothesis generation, all the components of what some people call cognitive computing. I don't see much of that going on in our industry right now. There's a huge potential to apply it, and it will make us a lot more efficient. It will drive out errors, it will drive out inefficiency, and hence it will drive down the costs of what we will do, and it will drive up the quality of our operations and our products. So I think there's a huge potential. In the customer-facing businesses, it's probably even more worrying, because in the old days, if you wanted to, well, still today actually, if you want to go and get some gasoline, you do it physically. You go to a gasoline station, you put it in there. Increasingly, if that choice is being made by a digital system, your sat-nav takes you to X's gasoline station rather than yours. The decision was taken inside a web platform or something. And if it's an autonomous vehicle, where's it going to go, and how does it decide where it goes to go and get groceries or gasoline? So this world is going to make a massive difference to us as we think about the customer interface, and the competition will shift into the digital space. So it's very important, and the state of the art is actually more cognitive, but it's early days yet, I would say. Sorry, go ahead.
2014, the world oil production was about 93.4 million barrels of oil a day.
Yeah.
In 2015, it was about 95.7 million barrels a day.
Yeah.
It is expected in 2016 that wouldn't be much over 96 million barrels of oil a day.
Yep.
And I expect much of this increase had been from the unconventional oil. But it seems like Saudi Arabia has jumped it to maximum production in there, and yet in 96 we're not adding but few 100,000 barrels of oil a day to the oil production. Can you see if these numbers are correct, and whether we have reached peak oil in conventional oil, not unconventional, but conventional oil? I feel like I've spent 40 years in the oil industry, so I feel like we have probably passed the peak oil in conventional oil, and I believe probably the biggest oil fields like Gawar and others, I think they're declining and pumping very hard to inject water to keep it up. I just want to know, see if you think these numbers are correct. Thank you.
I'm always much more comfortable answering questions about 2050 because it's a long way away. And people ask questions about tomorrow, and I get very nervous indeed because things can move around pretty quickly. I think your numbers are about correct, although I think that the increase in production from 2015 to 2016 looks like, I think, being around about 1 million barrels a day. The reality is that the comparatively low oil prices are stimulating demand, actually particularly here in North America. And what we're seeing is a balance between, on the one hand, significantly growing demand in the developing economies as people in China and places like that get into vehicles. And so that's causing a big ramp in demand for oil, whereas actually the demand is going down steadily in the mature economies because the improving efficiency of vehicles is resulting in a steady decline in demand for it. And then you also have competition from other sources of fuel going into the transportation system, so biofuels, natural gas, and electricity all coming into it. So that's actually driving demand down in the developed countries largely. The growth and the question really is when does the growth turn over in terms of growing the vehicle part in the more developing parts of the world, and then you have a set-in of the increasing efficiency and substitution of oil for other, presumably lower carbon energies. And so that will define the peak in the oil system in the world. And I think that the most recent energy outlook, which I'm not as well qualified to speak about, Spencer Dale, our chief economist, is much better on the shorter term questions. But I think what it shows is that in the most reliable prognosis, it pretty much plateaus, towards the end of the next decade. But in what they call the faster transition case, it goes up and starts to come down again in the 2020s if you're really going to try and shift towards a 2-degree scenario. So, I mean, the peak is, it doesn't feel to me as though the peak in oil production is that far away. It looks like it's within the next sort of 15 or so years, according to those range of forecasts forecast. Exactly when it will be driven very significantly by government policies and how serious they are about the commitments that they made in Paris. We have yet to see exactly how they get translated into policy in many nations in the world, and that will shape this because oil sits in the middle of the spectrum of very high carbon coal to comparatively low carbon natural gas, and oil will be impacted by the pace of action by governments to reduce carbon load in the atmosphere. I can't tell you when it's going to be, but these are the forces that are really at play, it seems to me, in shaping that profile.
I believe the other gentleman.
Was he there first? Okay.
CO2 capture and storage is essential to meet any climate targets, and you also talked about enhanced oil recovery.
Yep.
I'd like to get your view about the global challenges to get it deployed and how rapidly you see that coming, and what would be the signposts to suggest that it's going to be successful.
It's a great question. I'll preface it by saying that I think many of us have said for decades now that this is the most cost-effective way of reaching the world's goals. And the analysis that I see still shows that if your aim is to spend as little money as possible as a global community and achieve the 2-degree criterion, then carbon capture and sequestration plays a big part in that transition. And it's very difficult for me to say this as an engineer and a technologist, but it seems to me as though what happens in the world is not necessarily driven by techno-economic rationality. Regrettably for me, but it's not. So we would love to be able to plan our companies on the basis that every single government will simply do their sums and figure out the most cost-effective solution and go for that. And I mean, this comes back to the whole issue of a carbon price. And this is actually a price on carbon such that there is compensation for negative carbon. There's a business case for creating negative carbon. It won't happen even if, in theory, it should happen. So I've implicitly answered part of your question, which is that fundamentally what is required is for policymakers to value a carbon deficit or the absence of carbon as part of the transition to a low-carbon energy system globally. That's certainly what my company has been advocating, because if you take that particular tool away from you to achieve 450 ppm stabilization, then you have to resort to the tools you've got left, and some of those are considerably more expensive. So it'll cost more than $1 trillion per annum to transition to a low-carbon energy system. So I think policies associated with this are absolutely critical. I would put them as number one. There are issues more subtly. I mean, the cost of capture is still probably the most expensive part of this, and there are technologies that can be developed to drive that down. And people are having success in some other companies. I've talked to colleagues as part of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative have made some great progress on some of those technologies. So, that's very important, drive down the cost of capture. That's the single largest cost element. And the other part of it is risks associated with carbon storage, in particular long-term risks associated with carbon storage, because guaranteeing that it'll stay there for 1,000 years is all very well, but who's going to be around in 1,000 years' time to check that you did what you said you would? So at some point in time, there has to be a transfer to the nation or the relevant state to say it's now your liability. So, I mean, those are things that I think are quite important, and the only way you're going to find much out about this is by doing it for real and showing to people that the risks associated with this particular form of energy are no greater or perhaps lower than some of the others about which they worry hugely. I mean, I do find myself often involved in conversations which are very much single technology arguments. Nuclear is terrible or great, or wind is terrible or great. And the point is you have to line them all up and say, okay, fine, somebody hates everything, but we have got to do something. And so which one is appropriate in this particular place? And some countries have got much better geology for this than others. So they should probably do more of that, others should do more of the other. But I mean, those are some of the things that I would like to see happen in this space. It should be happening. Whether it will happen or not, I think is very much for regulators.
You already answered part of my question, but carbon capture sequestration certainly is technically feasible. The challenges are the economical feasibility in large scale. Any other technologies outlooks that BP might be working on thinking for reducing the carbon print other than carbon capture sequestration?
So two points I would make. I mean, the first of which is that, all the analysis I've seen from the IPCC and the IEA and others, they conjecture what sort of price on carbon is required to achieve stabilization at around about less than 2 degrees centigrade. And I've seen numbers that are, certainly well north of $100 a ton. Many are well north of $200 a ton. It gives you a sort of scoping shot on the kind of price of carbon that would be required to achieve stabilization. And at those sort of levels, I have no doubt whatsoever that carbon capture and sequestration, combined particularly with gas actually, because the net resultant power is cheaper, should be thoroughly economic. That's in the one world. The reality, though, is that when you can just burn the natural gas and give power, it seems like a huge amount of money to spend on addition for no extra power, in fact, for less power. So often the conversation about carbon capture and sequestration asked by the gentleman over there is a proxy for what's the carbon price going to be. It's a proxy for that. So that's one aspect of the conversation. In answer to your question, at least as a company, we're pretty clear on what we need to do to move in this direction. Number one is to tighten up our operations. So we have to make them as efficient as we can, and we certainly have to deal with methane fugitives. So that's looking to your own home and making sure that that's tight. The second thing is making sure that we have a portfolio that is resilient for a lower carbon future, and ours is moving steadily towards natural gas, it seems to me, as a consequence of that. The third thing is to invest in lower carbon options. We have, I think we operate more low carbon businesses than any one of our major competitors. So about 2 gigawatts of wind in America, 15,000 barrels a day of petrol equivalent, gas equivalent in Brazil of biofuels. And then we have a whole host of research and development programs and startup companies in which we've invested that are options in the lower carbon space. So that's the third thing we're doing. And to a certain extent, the world needs to do all these things too. So I'm not sure that we're very different from the world in that respect. And the last thing is, back to many of the questions, is to engage with, this is kind of an engagement. It was actually aimed largely at key stakeholders in the energy industry, is to engage in the conversation with people about what it will actually take to do what people say they would like to do. It's very easy to say we want to hit a certain target. It's quite another to show, well, this is actually what you're going to have to do. Are you up for that? So engagement with policymakers, not to tell them what policies should be, but to inform them based upon what we know, what the considerations are as they make regulations. So those are the four things that we're doing, and I don't think actually it's a lot different from what the world in general is going to engage in one way or another.
Thank you.
In your discussion of the study, you mentioned several times the financial impact of limitations on carbon.
Yeah.
Have you done any similar or similar kind of study as we slowly come to our senses on the politically driven limitations on carbon dioxide? Because I think we're slowly moving in the right direction on it. Have you done another study of that so you can see how much improvement it would be? I'm talking about financial improvement.
Yeah, I'm actually not quite sure exactly what you're asking. I'm sorry, I may have just misunderstood you. Can you repeat the question?
Well, your study is including a solid commitment to the politically driven limitations on carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the treaty in Paris.
Yeah.
Okay. I've personally been watching for the last 15 years, and I see us kind of slowly coming to our senses about what the real drive is behind that, which is not necessarily scientific, and it's certainly debatable. Have you done a similar kind of study where you could point out what the advantages are of not having to meet that kind of a politically driven requirement?
I think the answer is probably certainly not. And the reason is that we, as a company, have a huge respect for the scientists in the IPCC, and we've spent a lot of time supporting scientists as part of the Carbon Mitigation Initiative at Princeton, and we actually like to think that they know what they're talking about. So we are definitely living in a world in which 190-odd countries have signed up for an agreement in Paris. We adopt that as the context within which we operate. So, I mean, and I think, I don't know, I'm not a climate scientist. I have spent a lot of time in this space and been part of independent government panel inquiries into the subject, so I know a bit about it. But I mean, I personally don't, and my company doesn't debate the fact that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It's actually a fact. And that it's going up in the atmosphere, that's a fact. And the fact that one of the reasons for that is burning of fossil fuels, that's a fact. It seems to me as all the debate in the climate science community is more about whether the predictions of the future are correct rather than what's going on today. But no, we don't try and second guess the experts in the world on that. And we live within the confines and objectives of national regulations. So that's what we are working on, and we support that quite clearly. So there would be no point in our doing analysis of a contrary scenario.
In terms of the outlook, you've kind of talked about different technologies that are coming in, as well as disruptive technologies in the next 5 to 25 years or 35 years. My question is, what do you see as kind of large obstacles or challenges to integrate those technologies into your existing organization, whether it's data analytics or robotics or things like that? How do you see within BP or other companies the challenges to take advantage of those?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually quite, I mean, it's not easy to become great at data analytics. Just recruiting great data analysts is a bit tricky because they're paid vast sums of money by other companies in other sectors who seem to have big checkbooks. So, I mean, by and large, the way in which we go about that is to try and build a modicum of capability inside the company in spaces where we haven't in the past had much of it, either because it didn't exist or because that wasn't our core business. And then to partner with great companies who do this really, really well, and that's their, that's their day job, if you like. Now, whether we over time end up doing more of it inside the company or not, I don't know. But there are, great universities in many of these spaces with whom we work very closely, and there are great companies being built in these spaces with whom we work very closely. I mean, GE would be a good example of a company we have a collaborative research relationship developing an operations management system which uses very, very advanced data analytics. So, I think the answer is probably to your question is we try and partner with companies who are really good at it if it's not where we naturally came from. And we do find we can leverage and we're really good at supercomputing, and we have a lot of very good data scientists who are used to doing that kind of thing. So we have a lot of people who understand the language, and we can certainly set up our computers to do whatever analysis somebody else wants to do. But we partner, I think, is the answer. We don't pretend we can do it overnight ourselves.
Thanks very much for the interesting dialogue and presentation today. Just an observation and a question. You've used $80 as your 2050 reference price. That seems to be at parity with today's prices in real terms, which doesn't seem to leave any room for innovation unless cost structures drop by an order of magnitude. And then the follow-up is, what other price sensitivities did you do, and how did they sort of shift the relative balance of energy mix in the power sector? So
first thing is we use $80 a barrel real, not nominal. For that analysis. So it actually is not at parity with today. It's quite a bit higher. And when we did this work in 2011, 2012, I got a lot of stick from people in the company saying, "Oh, you're being very conservative here." So I mean, it depends. I'm still actually okay with 80. In terms, your question about sensitivities around oil price is a great one. And we do that very naturally. All companies do range ranges of sensitivities around oil prices in their economic analysis. Actually, what we were trying to do is to distill out what the technology signal was looking out to 2050, which is to some extent slightly independent of the oil price, but we're refreshing this work now, and we're including quite a lot of price sensitivities in it. The difficult thing is that there's a correlation between price and cost. And so, I mean, you know, it's a bit of a circular argument. In fact, you know, there are an infinite number of $80 a barrel worlds out there, and depending upon which $80 a barrel world you live in, you can get very different answers for some of the technology calculations you do. So it's actually quite difficult. We're struggling with that one right now, but this was, in that respect, quite a simple analysis. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, just a couple of things. You mentioned when a technology gets cheaper and more efficient, people use it more.
Yep.
That's Jevons theorem. It was English gentleman. In case you're interested, Google it. I just want to make sure that maybe it's not one-sided. If we could show by raise of hand who's in the renewable energy here. I am not, but just curious about. Okay. And you mentioned that this analysis was done in 2012.
Yeah.
And would you be shocked today, or you change your mind when you hear that, for example, countries like Peru and United Arab Emirates and Mexico, from what I'm reading, they are contracting for 3 or 5 cents kilowatt hours. Is that a shock to you, or is that something?
So since we did this work, my observation, what's changed since then? And hence, where were we not quite as right as we thought we were? Our batteries have come down faster in cost than we thought. Solar cells have come down faster in cost than we thought. That's behind the bids that you're talking about in places like Peru. The productivity of shale wells has gone up more than we thought it would, and actually nuclear costs have gone up relative to what we thought. So, I mean, you know, it was not correct, and those are the things we've seen. When you get what we also implicitly build into this analysis is that the supply chains achieve a 10% return on capital. That's quite an important point, because today, one of the reasons that solar cells and batteries are quite low cost is because there's massive oversupply in those supply chains, and those companies that make some of these things, you know, are being effectively bankrolled to carry on doing it with a view to the fact that it's going to come back to some kind of stabilization. And we've seen this before. We've seen massive drops in price in different forms of the energy sector, and then it goes to the side when that catches up, and then it goes on the next trajectory. So quite what difference it makes going out to 2050, what's happening right here and now in the marketplaces is a little bit difficult to parse apart. So we're going to look at what the impact is. I would expect to see the longer term, expectation for solar PV and batteries to drop, and hence battery electric vehicles to improve in the next study we do relative to the one we did before. But we are going to look at the underlying questions about the supply chains again, because there are some people who make pretty horrific forecasts as to what will happen to the price of lithium if you go for the maximum scenario on battery vehicles, or for the price of platinum for fuel cells. And so you start to need to look again at some of those supply chains to see whether they're robust to these possible worlds. But the answer to your question is yes. Am I shocked? I'm surprised, because I tend to believe our analysis, and then of course you get it wrong. Yes. Therefore, in that case, I'm surprised how much progress they've made, and that certainly brings closer to home the point at which you might say a shift from one mode in the system to another.
How about that Tesla Model 3, which is in the $30,000, $200-mile range? I mean, is that?
Yeah, I mean, it looks a great car to me. I spent last week in Silicon Valley, and I noticed there's quite a lot of them driving around there. $35,000 is still quite a lot for a vehicle, but they are a great car.
How much you said?
$35,000 for the Tesla Model 3.
I can tell you today, if you put it in front of me with 200-mile range, if it's deliverable, I will buy it. I don't know how many people will buy it. But
yeah, I mean, the question, absolutely, there's a big uncertainty around that. If you achieve the higher levels of penetration of electric transport into the world's energy systems that people suggest are possible by about 2035, you can take about 10 million barrels a day out of the global demand for oil. But, I mean, back to my earlier comment slightly, you cannot cannot consider these things in isolation. You have to consider the system as a whole. And the system, if everybody starts plugging in their vehicle, we just total mode shift, then you have really quite big challenges in your power system. Which you also have to deal with, and that's quite a thing that takes time. So it's fine for low levels of penetration, but as we've seen in power, we would no doubt, the renewable supplies, and we would no doubt see electrification. If you do it all, then you really have to do major changes to your system. So I think we have to think of these things as a system issue and a system opportunity as well as a system challenge, and balancing the world's power systems is going to be a huge challenge going forward as we have more and more intermittent sources and demands in the case of vehicles.
Thank you. We all realize in this audience that money is really tight in the oil business right now, that R&D budgets or investments outside of companies are collapsing faster than even the oil price seems to have this year. You recommend what BP finances in research across the globe, I presume. If you're looking at over making the best bang for your buck in investments in the next 5 years, where do you suggest BP put its money?
The good thing is that, the business of BP is not run by the technology department. Unfortunate for me, but I've learned, I've been doing this job as head of technology in BP for 8 years now, and I've come to very much appreciate that in big companies like mine, we are one of the inputs to business and strategy choices. We're not the only input to it. And so it would be pretty unwise, I think, for me to tell anybody what to do. What we do, though, is we inform the strategy of the company. We say, this is where we think things are going, and you better change or you better capture that. And so business strategy changes accordingly, and then we line the technology up with those choices. And it's pretty much done business by business. The case for technology investment in advanced lubricants, for example, is actually quite different from the case for investment in technology in deep water or shale. They're just quite different. And I by and large look at those businesses independently. I don't say, the $10 of technology is better spent here than there. It's quite a dangerous thing to do because you're optimizing those individual business models. What I do try and do is at the group level is to capture things that I think are highly leveraging and cross-cutting across the whole company. So this is not an answer to your question. But what I get to decide by myself almost is what do we spend money on that other people aren't spending money on. And some of the questions which have come in earlier on around the march from getting access to your data to doing decent data analytics to doing more machine learning and ultimately cognitive is a journey we're certainly driving hard across the whole company. We have a biosciences program, an advanced materials program, and these are ones that we think are highly leveraging across all of our businesses, and I'm excited about those from a longer term perspective as sources of technology for BP.
Time for one last question.
You've done a lot of work, as far as what the CO2 and the Paris Accord will require. Have you looked at the technical feasibility, both from a technical resources, a people point of view, as well as capital, in order to be able to switch over to meet that, and how fast globally, if we decide we want to do it, let's say today we set $200, a ton for carbon, how fast can that be done, and what's the resource? Because I look at this kind of energy substitution. So you're taking money to invest, even though there's a return on it. There's no other productive, it's taking capital away from other sources.
I don't think we do a lot of independent analysis into that particular question. The IEA's work suggests that if another $1 trillion odd a year are spent on shifting the world's energy systems towards a lower carbon trajectory, that you can actually meet the 2 degrees C criterion, and that's about 1/70th of world GDP. What's not included in that calculation is the benefit that you get of a very different nature, whether it be sea level not rising or people having a better environment. So it's not a very fair calculation, but I mean, I think lots of governments have implicitly decided that calculation is worth it. I think the really difficult thing is how do you cause that money to be spent, where do you cause it to be spent, and who actually pays for it. And that's implicitly part of the big discussion. I think they tried last time around in Copenhagen to sort of do this on a global basis, more top-down, and that didn't work, nor did Kyoto, whereas the Paris Agreement is very much bottom-up. It's what nations say they're prepared to do. And I think it's a little bit like asking for volunteers. You know, if everybody else steps back, you look a little bit isolated. But if you all step forward, there is still a chance to ask for more volunteers, and you can step forward again. It seems to me as though that is the process that the International Energy Agency is trying to generate, in which everybody does what they can. And when they see that they've all moved forward somewhat, there's an opportunity to move forward some more. But I don't pretend it's been very, very difficult to date, and I'm not sure it's going to be that easy, because at the end of the day, one has to cause a very significant turnaround in the consumption of coal in countries like China and India, and the question is, how do you actually do that? So I don't pretend that it's easy. I think technically there is a solution, and you can calculate what that solution is, and then you get into the more difficult questions about, well, exactly how do you fund that? But $1 trillion a year, it seems it's a huge sum of money in some respects, but in other respects, it shouldn't be impossible for a global community that is actually spending an awful lot more than that on its global enterprise.
Join me in thanking David Eyton.
Thank you very much. Cheers, guys.